I didn't even look at her when he said it. That was the part that cut deepest. Harold Fenwick, the man who had promised Clara's dying uncle that she would be taken care of, stood in the doorway of his office, counting coins from a small tin box, and said, without raising his eyes, "The arrangement is finished. Your uncle owed me more than he left. Whatever you thought you were inheriting, there is nothing. You have until morning to clear out." Clara stood there holding the letter her uncle had written her. The ink was still crisp. The promises were still in it. And Harold Fenwick, respected church-going Harold Fenwick, simply turned his back and closed the door. If that was you, if the last door in the world just closed in your face, what would you have done? Before we go further, if stories like this one find something real in you, something you've carried quietly for years, please subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. Now let's go back to where it truly began. The morning Harold Fenwick turned his back on Clara Winslow, she was 25 years old and had exactly $3.40 in her coat pocket. She knew the amount because she had counted it twice on the train west, pressing the coins together in her palm like they were seeds she might somehow plant into something. She had told herself the counting was practical. Really, it was the only thing she could control. She had come to Redstone Crossing, Wyoming, on the strength of two things: a letter from her Uncle Bernard saying, "Come, there is work, there is space, there is family here," and the particular stubbornness that had kept her alive through a childhood that had not been kind to her. Her mother died of fever when Clara was 9. Her father left before she was old enough to understand what leaving meant. Uncle Bernard was the only person on earth who had ever used her name the way a person should use someone's name, gently, like it mattered. Bernard had died 6 weeks before she arrived. She didn't know that until she stepped off the train. The man who met her at the station wasn't a kind-faced uncle with rough hands and a warm coat. It was a boy, maybe 14, holding a folded piece of paper with her name written on it in handwriting she didn't recognize. The paper said that Bernard Winslow had passed from a lung sickness on the 14th of October, and that his affairs had been settled by his business partner, one Harold Fenwick, and that Miss Clara Winslow was expected at Fenwick's offices on Garnet Street the following morning. She stood on that train platform for a long time after the boy left. She didn't cry. She wanted to. The need to cry sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't swallow and couldn't spit out. But the people moving around her were strangers, and there is a particular kind of pride in a person who has survived mostly alone, the kind that will not let you fall apart in front of people who don't know your name. So she picked up her satchel, she found a hotel that would take $1 for the night, and she sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled like old wood and pipe smoke, and she told herself, tomorrow. Handle it tomorrow. Tomorrow turned out to be Harold Fenwick. She had imagined him as someone who might have known Bernard, a man with some roughness to him, some honest dirt under his nails. What she found instead was a man who wore his respectability like a suit of armor. His office was neat in the way that offices are neat when the person inside them wants you to believe they are very important. There were framed certificates on the wall. There was a woman at a desk near the door who looked at Clara's coat and then looked away. Fenwick had shaken Clara's hand. He had offered her a chair. He had said, "I am sorry for your loss," and said it the way people say things they have said many times before, so many times that the words have been completely emptied out. Then he had opened a ledger. Bernard had borrowed money. More money than Clara had known. He had borrowed it to buy land that turned out to be disputed, and then borrowed more to fight the dispute in court, and then borrowed more still when the court did not go his way. By the time the lung sickness took him, Bernard Winslow owned almost nothing except the memory of his intentions, which, Fenwick explained, had no legal value. "What about the house?" Clara asked. "He wrote that there was a house. Reclaimed. Against the debt. The tools, everything in the estate applied to the balance." Fenwick had his fingers laced together on the desk. "I want you to understand, Miss Winslow, that I am not without sympathy. Your uncle was a decent man who made poor decisions. That is a common story out here." "He told me to come," she said. "He told me there would be a place for me. He believed that when he wrote it, I expect." She had looked at this man across his very clean desk and tried to find something in his face that she could appeal to, some place where the sympathy he was claiming actually lived. She found nothing. Harold Fenwick was not a cruel man. He was something worse. He was a man who had decided long ago that his ledger told the truth and everything else was sentiment. She left his office with the same $3.40. That was how Clara Winslow came to be sitting on the steps of the Painted Rail Hotel at 4:30 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in November, with a satchel on her lap and nowhere to go. The wind in Redstone Crossing was the kind of wind that does not negotiate. It came off the mountains with a directness that felt almost personal, like it had decided to single her out specifically, and it moved through her wool coat as if the coat were made of paper. She wasn't sitting there to be pitied. She was sitting there because sitting was the only thing she could afford to do while she thought. Walking cost energy she was trying to conserve. The hotel behind her was where she'd spent the previous night's dollar, and she did not have another dollar to spend on it. She had eaten a heel of bread that morning. She was not yet at the point of asking strangers for food, but she could see that point from where she was standing, and it frightened her more than anything Harold Fenwick had said. People passed. A woman with a basket of laundry on her hip glanced at her and moved on. Two men in canvas coats were talking about a horse they'd bought and regretting it. A dog nosed around the base of the steps and then lost interest in her entirely, which felt like an accurate summary of her situation. She had started to think, the specific, quiet, practical thinking of someone who has run out of options and is methodically checking each door for a latch she might have missed, when she heard footsteps stop in front of her. She looked up expecting another stranger. What she saw was a small boy, maybe 7 years old, with his father's coat collar turned up against the wind, and a face so serious it was almost funny. He was looking at her the way children look at things they haven't decided about yet. "Why do you look so alone?" he said. "Eli," a man's voice from somewhere above and to the left of the boy. "That's not... Come on." "But she looks like she's waiting for something that already left," the boy said, still looking at Clara. Clara Winslow, who had not cried on the train platform or in Harold Fenwick's office or in her $1 hotel room, almost lost it right there on those steps because of a 7-year-old boy with cold, reddened cheeks who said the truest thing anyone had said to her in weeks. She pressed her lips together hard, looked up past the boy to his father. The man was tall and not comfortable about it. The kind of tall that comes with a slight forward lean, like he'd spent years trying to take up a little less space. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had been introduced to a razor sometime in the last several days, but not recently. He was looking at his son with the expression of a man who has accepted that his child will say embarrassing things and has decided the only response is quiet dignity. "I'm sorry," the man said. "He doesn't..." He stopped, looked at Clara properly for the first time, and something shifted in his face. Not pity exactly, but recognition. Like he knew what it looked like when a person was holding themselves together by the thinnest possible thread. Do you need something?" "I'm fine," Clara said immediately. She was not fine. He could clearly see she was not fine. She could see him seeing it, and the particular humiliation of that, of being seen clearly when you've told yourself you're invisible, made her straighten her spine and look at a point just past his shoulder. "My name's Silas Granger," the man said. "This is Eli. We were just going to get something to eat before heading back out to the ranch." "Clara Winslow," she said, "and I appreciate the introduction, but I don't need charity." Silas Granger said nothing for a moment, then, "I didn't offer any," which was true and made her feel foolish. Eli was still watching her with that patient, serious face. "You could eat with us," he said. "Dad always gets too much soup. He thinks he's hungrier than he is." "Eli, it's true. You always have soup left." Silas pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. Clara found herself, against everything she was feeling, almost smiling. "I'm not going to impose on your supper," she said. "You're not imposing if you're invited," Eli said, with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old who has found a logical loophole and intends to live in it. Silas looked at his son. Then he looked at Clara. Then he did something she would think about for a long time afterward. He didn't make a big gesture of it, didn't make a speech about Christian generosity or the duty of neighbors. He just said quietly, "Place down the street makes good stew. It's warm in there, which is more than I can say for out here." And that was all. Clara sat in that warmth for a moment. Not the restaurant's warmth, they hadn't moved yet, but the warmth of being asked, and felt something she'd nearly forgotten the texture of. She stood up, picked up her satchel. "All right," she said. The restaurant, if that's the right word for a room with mismatched tables and a woman named Dot who cooked everything in one enormous pot, was indeed warm. Clara sat across from Silas and Eli and wrapped her hands around a bowl of stew and felt the heat work its way up through her palms and into something that had been cold for days. They didn't ask her many questions at first. Eli did most of the talking, reporting in careful detail the various things he had seen and thought that day, including a disagreement between two roosters outside the feed store that he considered more entertaining than anything his schoolteacher had attempted. Silas listened to his son the way some men listen to music, with most of his attention, not performing it. Once, while Eli was mid-sentence about the roosters, Silas glanced across the table at Clara's hands. They were shaking very slightly around the bowl because she had been cold for a while and stew was working through the chill, and also because she was more exhausted than she had let herself know. He didn't comment on it. He looked it away. "What brought you to Redstone Crossing?" he asked, eventually. She told him the short version. Family that was there and then wasn't. A promise that had already died before she arrived. She did not mention Harold Fenwick by name, but something in the set of her jaw when she described the office and the man behind the desk made Silas very still in the way people get still when they understand something exactly. "He let you walk out with nothing?" Silas asked. "He let me walk out with exactly what I came with," she said, which was apparently enough, in his opinion. Silas turned his coffee cup once in its saucer. "Fenwick," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up. "You know him." "I know what he is." His voice was flat, not angry exactly, but with the density of a feeling he had decided not to expand on in front of his son. "He's done similar to others. There's a widow on the South Road who'd tell you the same story." "Good to know I'm not uniquely foolish," Clara said, and she meant it to come out wry. And it did, mostly, except for the part underneath it that was just true. Eli, who had been eating through all of this with considerable focus, looked up. "You're not foolish," he said. "Dad says only foolish people think they can tell right away who's foolish and who isn't." Silas blinked. "I said something like that." "You said almost exactly that. You have a very accurate memory for conversations you weren't supposed to be fully paying attention to." "I always pay attention," Eli said simply, and went back to his bowl. Clara looked at this boy. This 7-year-old with his soup-warm cheeks and his unnerving clarity, and felt the stone in her chest shift, not disappear, but move. Like it had been sitting in one place so long it had made a groove, and now something had nudged it, and she couldn't feel the groove anymore, only the object lifting slightly off the bottom. After supper, Silas paid. She tried to insist on paying her share, and he said, "You've got $3 and some change, and winter's not done yet, so don't argue with me about this." Which startled her, because she hadn't mentioned the amount, and then she realized she had counted the coins under the table while she was talking, a habit she'd fallen into, and he had simply been watching and adding up. She didn't know whether to be embarrassed or grateful. She settled on grateful because it was more useful. He also, without announcement, went to the front desk of the hotel and paid for 2 more nights in her room. "You don't have to," she started. 2 days is enough time to find work," he said. "If you want to find it, I imagine you do." "I do," she said. I know you don't take charity," he said. "I'm not offering it. I'm offering logistics. There's a difference." He handed her a key, her same key, just extended. 2 days. After that, you'll have sorted something. It was stated as a fact, not a comfort. That was what made it actually comforting. She stood in the lobby of the Painted Rail Hotel, holding her extended key, and watched Silas Granger put his hat back on, check that Eli's coat was properly buttoned, and walk out into the Wyoming night as if he hadn't just done something significant. Eli turned back at the door. "I hope you find a good thing," he said, with the gravity of someone delivering an important dispatch. Then he was gone. Clara Winslow stood there for a long moment. Then she walked up to her room, set her satchel on the floor, sat down on the bed in the old wood and pipe smoke room, and cried. Not the tragic kind of crying, not the kind that means everything is lost. The other kind. The kind that comes when something tight has been held for too long and someone has, without permission, simply been kind to you, and the tightness has nowhere left to live. She cried for maybe 10 minutes. Then she washed her face in the cold water from the basin. Then she thought, 2 days. He said 2 days. She was going to need less than that. She gave herself one night to feel sorry about things. That was the rule she'd made sometime around age 12, when feeling sorry had started to feel like a luxury she couldn't always afford. One night. Then you got up and you found the next thing. The next thing, it turned out, was the wash house on Clement Street. She found it by walking. She was out before the hotel had fully woken up, when the sky over the mountains was the color of a bruise healing, and the street was empty except for a man hauling a milk cart and a dog that had apparently decided the milk cart was its personal enemy. She walked the length of Redstone Crossing twice, which didn't take long. It was not a big town, more an accumulation of intentions than an actual settlement, buildings that had arrived gradually and arranged themselves without much consultation. She noted the dry goods store, the bank with its self-important facade, a barber shop that looked like it had been losing an argument with its own sign for several years. And then on Clement Street she smelled hot water and lye soap, and she followed it the way a cold person follows a fire. The wash house was owned by a woman named Ruth Calloway, who was approximately 60 years old and had the posture of someone who had spent decades refusing to let the weight of things bend her. She was already working when Clara knocked on the open door, her arms deep in a steaming tub, a line of shirts waiting their turn on a bench, like patients in a doctor's waiting room. "Help you?" Ruth said without looking up. "I'm looking for work," Clara said. "So is half the territory." Ruth glanced up then, did a fast assessment that Clara suspected covered more ground than it appeared to. "You done wash work before?" "I've done most kinds of work before." "That's not an answer to the question I asked." "I've washed my own clothes since I was 9, Clara said. "I learn fast and I don't complain about heat or hours." Ruth looked at her for another moment. "I pay $3 a week. You work 6 days. You eat your lunch somewhere that isn't in my wash house because I don't have space for people eating while they're working. You show up late once, I dock a day. You show up late twice, we're done." She pulled her arms out of the tub. "You have a place to sleep?" "The painted rail, 2 more nights paid." Ruth made a sound that was not quite dismissive, not quite sympathetic. "My sister-in-law rents a room in her house on Birch Lane. $1.50 a week. It's not large, but it's dry and she doesn't bother her tenants." She dried her hands on a towel that had seen better decades. "You want the work or not?" "I want it," Claire said. "Start now then. There's an apron on the hook." That was how it went. No ceremony, no period of consideration. Ruth Calloway was a woman who believed that actions were the only resume that mattered, and she would form her opinion of Clara Winslow by watching her work, not by listening to her talk about it. Clara tied the apron and found her place at the second tub and started. The work was brutal in the specific way that honest physical labor is brutal. It asked everything from the body and gave nothing back except the fact of completion. By noon her hands were raw. By mid-afternoon her shoulders had begun a conversation with her that she did not enjoy. The steam in the wash house sat on everything, on her hair and her skin and her lungs, and the smell of lye was so constant it stopped being a smell and became simply the air. She did not complain. She had told Ruth she wouldn't, and she meant it, but it also wasn't purely pride. The work had a rhythm to it that she found, after the first difficult hour, almost steadying. Put in, press, ring, hang. Put in, press, ring, hang. It was something she could do without needing to know what came next. That mattered right now more than she would have expected. Ruth watched her without appearing to watch her, which Clara recognized as the particular skill of a person who has managed other people long enough to know that being observed changes behavior. At the end of the day, Ruth said, "You'll do." It was not lavish praise. It was worth more than lavish praise. Clara moved into the room on Birch Lane 2 days later, the last of the nights Silas had paid for at the hotel. The room was small, as advertised, with a single window that looked onto a fence and a stubborn patch of something that had once been a garden. Ruth's sister-in-law was named Vera, and she was a quiet woman who left a pitcher of water outside Clara's door each morning and otherwise respected the privacy she'd promised. Clara had a bed, a chair, a small table, and a hook on the wall for her coat. She had $3 a week coming in and $1.50 going out. She was mathematically surviving. It was not comfortable. She was on her feet for 10 hours a day, and in the evenings her hands hurt enough that holding a fork was its own small project. She went to bed before 8 most nights because there was nothing else she could afford to spend energy on. She didn't make friends quickly. She was too tired for the social performances that friendship requires in its early stages, the careful presentations of self, the strategic sharing of small truths to establish trust. Mostly she worked and ate and slept and got up and did it again. But Redstone Crossing began to take shape for her, the way places do when you stop moving through them and start living in them. She learned which vendors at the market were honest about their weights and which ones needed watching. She learned that the woman who ran the dry goods store, a Mrs. Hadley, kept a jar of hard candy on the counter for children, but also, this was not advertised, for any adult who looked like they'd had a hard day, and that she offered it without comment, which Clara came to understand was a form of grace. She learned that the man who swept the street in front of the bank every morning was named Cyrus, and had been doing it for 11 years and took considerable pride in it, and would tell you so at length if you gave him any opening. She did not see Silas Granger again for almost 3 weeks. When she did, it was at the market on a Saturday morning, and he was in the middle of an argument with a vendor over the price of flour that he appeared to be losing through sheer stubbornness rather than any sound logic. She watched for a moment from a few feet away. He was bad at arguing, she could tell within 30 seconds, because he had the kind of fundamental decency that makes a man uncomfortable pressing a point even when he's right, so he kept almost making his case and then retreating slightly, which only encouraged the vendor. "He's been overcharging on flour for a year," said a small voice beside her. She looked down. Eli Granger was standing next to her with a list in his hand written in handwriting too careful to be a child's, which meant Silas had written it and Eli was carrying it with great responsibility. He was wearing the same serious expression she remembered from the hotel steps. "Has he?" Clara said. "Dad knows it too," Eli said. "He just doesn't like to make people feel bad. That's a useful quality in most situations, and a problem in this one." "That's what I think too." Eli looked at her. "You found work." "I did." "And a place to sleep?" "And a place to sleep." He nodded as if this confirmed something he had hoped for. "Good," he said. Then, with a slight shift in his expression, "Dad wondered. He didn't say he wondered, but I could tell." Clara looked at Silas, who had finally made a point that landed and was now looking slightly surprised that it had. "He's welcome to ask," she said. "He doesn't ask about people," Eli said. "He waits until he accidentally finds out." He considered this. "It takes a long time sometimes." Eli. Silas had finished at the flour vendor and turned around and found his son standing next to Clara Winslow, apparently delivering a psychological profile. The expression on his face was interesting. "Miss Winslow." "Mr. Granger." A pause. He had flour now, and a list of other things he needed, and somewhere out on the edge of town, a ranch that required his return. He was a busy man, and she was an acquaintance of 3 weeks' standing, and there was absolutely no reason for this conversation to be anything other than brief and polite. "You found work," he said. "Your son informed you?" "He informed me that you had," Eli said to Silas. "Just now." Silas looked at his son with an expression that contained several things: exasperation, affection, resignation to the specific situation of being this child's parent. "Ruth Calloway's place?" he said to Clara. "You know it." "I know Ruth." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but a loosening. "She working you hard?" "Extremely." "Good," he said, and then caught himself. No, you mean good," Clara said, "because hard work from someone who won't coddle you is better than easy work from someone who thinks you need handling." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That's what I mean." They stood in the market with the noise and movement of a Saturday morning going on around them. The vendor arguments and the loaded carts, and the women comparing prices, and the men trying to look like they weren't comparing prices. And Clara thought about how strange it was to be standing here, in this town she hadn't planned to be in, talking to a man she hadn't planned to meet, feeling not happy exactly, that was too simple a word, but something in the direction of steady. "I should get the rest of the list," Silas said. "Of course." He took a step, stopped. "There's Mara, my daughter. She's been asking Eli about the woman on the hotel steps." His version of the story is fairly dramatic. He did not look embarrassed about this. He was simply reporting a fact. "She'd likely pester you with questions if you ever happened to be out at the ranch. I'm just mentioning it, in case you happen to be out that way." Clara looked at him. Is that an invitation? It's a warning, he said, and possibly also an invitation. He tipped his hat, a genuine gesture, not performative, and moved on down the market. Eli gave Clara a long look. He practiced that, Eli said. He practiced saying it like he hadn't practiced it. Yes. Eli looked at his list. I need to find the rest of these things. He walked off with the dignity of someone who has delivered important intelligence and considers the mission complete. Clara stood in the market holding a small bag of dried beans and thought that this was possibly the strangest 3 weeks she had ever lived through. Then she thought about a daughter named Mara, who had been asking questions about a woman on hotel steps, and she felt something small and new turn over in her chest. She went out to the Granger Ranch on a Sunday afternoon because she had Sunday afternoons and no particular claim on them. The ranch was a 40-minute ride out of town on a horse she borrowed, a mild brown horse named Butter that belonged to Vera's neighbor and that regarded Clara with calm indifference throughout the journey. The land was wide out here, and the mountains were the kind of presence that makes you feel both small and, oddly, less alone. The wind had dropped for once, and the air was cold and still and smelled like pine and frozen earth. The ranch itself looked like a place that had once had very clear opinions about itself and had gradually stopped enforcing them. The fences were solid. She could see Silas in that. The basic structure held. But there were places where things had been left, not neglected exactly, but deferred. A gate that needed rehinging, a porch step that had been replaced with a board that wasn't quite the same width. Kitchen garden that had been well planned once and was now just the idea of a garden, the bones of it remaining, the rest surrendered. She saw all of this as Butter carried her up the track. She also noticed that the house itself was clean, not scrubbed clean, not the kind of clean that happens when someone is trying to prove something, but picked up clean, the kind that happens when someone is doing what they can with the time available. A small girl appeared in the doorway before Clara had dismounted. Mara Granger was 9 years old and had her father's dark hair and an expression of complete self-possessed interest that Clara suspected she had not inherited from anyone in particular but had developed on her own. She watched Clara dismount and tie Butter to the post with the careful attention of a person taking notes. "You're the woman from the hotel steps," Mara said. "Eli told you." "He tells everything. Did you really have nowhere to go?" "Mara." Silas appeared behind his daughter, wiping his hands on a rag. He gave Clara a look that said he was sorry, and also that he had tried to prepare for this, and clearly failed. "It's a fair question," Clara said. She looked at Mara. "I had nowhere to go that day. I've got somewhere now." Mara considered this. What changed? "I worked," Clara said, "and your father paid for 2 extra nights at the hotel, which gave me enough time to find that work." Mara turned to look up at her father. "You paid for her hotel?" "I lent her time," Silas said, his voice careful. "It wasn't charity." "He said that to me too," Clara told Mara. "I believe he means it." Mara seemed to decide that this was satisfactory and stepped back from the door. "You can come in," she said, with the tone of someone granting access to a space they feel some authority over. The inside of the house was warmer than the outside and smelled like coffee and something baked that had happened earlier that day. Mara's contribution, as it turned out. She had made cornbread from a recipe she had learned by watching and then largely ignored the measurements on. It was dense and a little uneven, but tasted fine. She told Clara this without apparent self-consciousness, which Clara found refreshing. They sat at the kitchen table, Clara and Silas and Mara and Eli, who had appeared from somewhere with mud on his boots and a look of satisfaction that suggested the mud had been earned in some project he considered worthwhile. Silas poured coffee. Mara asked questions. The questions were occasionally startling in their directness. Did Clara have a husband? Did she want one? Why had she come all the way to Wyoming if her uncle was sick? Had she been very scared on the train? What was it like to wash other people's clothes all day? Clara answered all of them. Some of the answers were short. Some were longer than she expected. At one point, answering a question about whether she missed her uncle, she said something she hadn't quite said to herself before. "I miss the idea of him being somewhere. It's different from missing the person. The person was already mostly gone the last few years. But knowing there was somewhere I could point to and say, that's family, that's the part that's harder to replace." Silas was quiet after that. Not uncomfortable quiet. The kind of quiet that means someone understood something and is sitting with it. After another hour, the light outside had started its early winter retreat, and Clara said she should get back before dark. Silas walked her out to where Butter was tied. "She'll ask you back," he said. "Mara. She's going to want to know the rest." "The rest of what?" "The rest of the story. She's decided you have one." "She's not wrong," Clara said. He untied Butter and handed her the reins. Since her mother, she doesn't attach easily to people." He said it carefully, like it was something he had thought about how to say. "So I'm telling you, not to put anything on you, just, she's starting to attach." Clara held the reins and looked at him. "I understand what you're telling me." "Good." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Not by choice." She swung up into the saddle. "I'll come back Sunday, if that's all right." "It's all right," he said. She rode back toward town with the mountains going orange-pink behind her, and the cold coming back into the air, and something complicated and new moving around in her chest alongside the thing that had been there all along. She went back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. And then, because Mara started asking if she could come on Saturdays too, she went on Saturdays as well, just for the afternoon, just because she had the time. It didn't announce itself as anything. That was what she would remember later. That nothing had a ceremony to it, no clear beginning. She just kept going out to the ranch, and things accumulated. She noticed that the children were eating too much salt bread and not enough vegetables, and she started bringing things from the market. Not as a gift, she made sure to pay, and cooking them into meals while Mara watched and asked questions and occasionally made suggestions that were wrong but showed good instincts. She noticed that the kitchen garden still had good soil under the dead growth, and one Saturday she asked Silas if he'd mind if she cleared some of it. And he looked at her for a moment and then said he wouldn't mind, and she spent 3 hours pulling frozen growth and turning soil while Eli helped by carrying things and Mara supervised. None of this was planned. That was the honest truth of it. She wasn't constructing something, wasn't calculating angles toward any particular outcome. She was just finding that the ranch was where she wanted to spend the time she had, which was a feeling so unfamiliar that she kept examining it from different directions to make sure it was what she thought it was. Ruth noticed, the way Ruth noticed everything. "You're going out to Granger's," she said one day, not as a question. "On Sundays," Clara said, hands still moving. "And Saturdays now, I hear." "Redstone Crossing is a small town," Clara said. "It is," Ruth agreed. She wrung out a shirt with an authority that suggested the shirt had been arguing with her. "Silas Granger is a decent man who has been beating himself up for 5 years." "About what?" Ruth gave her a look. "His wife didn't die peacefully. It was difficult. He thinks, and he will think this until someone convinces him otherwise, that he should have done something different, done more. He can't tell you what. Neither can anyone else. But it sits on him." Clara was quiet. "The children need someone," Ruth said. "That's plain enough to see. What's less plain is what Silas needs, because he's the kind of man who won't tell you even when he knows." She paused. "Which means you'll have to figure it out yourself, if you decide you want to." "I haven't decided anything," Clara said. "No," Ruth said, "but you're out there every Saturday and Sunday." She went back to the shirt. "Just keep your eyes open is all." The thing about Redstone Crossing, though, was that not everyone was Ruth Calloway. Not everyone watched quietly and kept their opinions to themselves until they had something useful to say. The whispers had started sometime around the 5th or 6th Sunday, when Clara's Butter had been seen tied outside the Granger Ranch enough times that it had become something people mentioned. In a town this size, anything that happened 3 times was a pattern, and anything that was a pattern became a subject of discussion. And discussion in Redstone Crossing moved the way wind moved. It went everywhere, and you couldn't always tell where it started. She heard it first from Vera, who mentioned it gently and without malice, the way good people convey gossip. They warn you about it rather than enjoying it. "People are saying you've set your cap at Silas Granger," Vera said one evening, in the neutral tone of someone reading from a newspaper. "I'm not saying I think that. I'm telling you what's being said." "And what else are they saying?" Clara asked. Vera hesitated. "That a woman with nothing to her name and nowhere to go is a practical woman, and that a ranch needs a woman to run it." She looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I don't think that's fair." "It's not entirely wrong, though," Clara said. "I do have nothing to my name, and I am practical." She thought about it. The part they're missing is why I go out there, which isn't any of those reasons. She wasn't sure she could fully explain the reasons even to herself. The children? Yes. Mara had gotten under her skin in the particular way that smart, motherless girls can get under your skin, with their combination of sharpness and need, so careful not to show the need directly. Eli, with his impossible seriousness and the way he occasionally said something that was simply true in a way that most adults couldn't manage. The kitchen garden with its stubborn good soil. The coffee that was always too strong because Silas had no system for measuring it and refused to develop one. Silas. She was being honest with herself, at least privately. She was not sure what she felt about Silas Granger. She found him easier to be around than most people, which was unusual for her. She found that his silences were comfortable in a way that other people's silences weren't, that he said what he meant and meant what he said and didn't add a lot of extra material for social lubrication, which she appreciated. She found that she noticed when he was tired before he said anything about it, and that she wanted to do something about it when she noticed, which was the kind of wanting that had no clean categorical name. She also found that she didn't trust it. Not him. She trusted him. She didn't trust her own reading of the feeling. She had spent enough years needing things and learning to suppress that need, to file it down so it didn't catch on anything, that when something genuine started happening, she couldn't tell the difference right away between a true feeling and a desperate one. And she refused to be desperate. She had promised herself that at some point she couldn't quite remember. She had promised herself that she would never do something out of desperation and call it love. Which was why, when the other offer came, it complicated things in a way she hadn't anticipated. His name was Douglas Hale, and he was the second largest ranch owner in the valley. He was 53 years old, recently widowed himself, and he had a large house and a reputation for fair dealing and 4 grown children who had already left for other territories. He came into the wash house on a Thursday morning, which was itself unusual. Men of his position did not generally come personally to collect laundry. And he asked for Clara Winslow specifically, which Ruth watched with an expression of absolute neutrality that Clara recognized as extreme interest. He was courteous. He was respectful. He sat in the chair that Ruth pointed him to, and he told Clara plainly that he had heard she was a competent and honest woman who had made something from nothing, and that he admired that, and that he was in need of someone capable to manage his household, which was large, and that if she were willing to consider it, he was prepared to offer her a position that paid considerably more than washwork, with a room that was considerably larger than her current one, and that he hoped she would think about it. He did not say he was offering marriage. He said position and management and salary, all clean, practical words. But the offer beneath the offer was not hard to read, and Clara suspected he knew she was reading it, and that this careful, indirect approach was his way of giving her room to say no to either part of it without embarrassing either of them. He left her his card. He said he hoped to hear from her. After he left, Ruth stood at her tub and said nothing for approximately 2 minutes. "You're not going to say anything?" Clara finally asked. "I'm thinking," Ruth said. "About what?" "About what you're going to do." Ruth wrung out a sheet with considerable force. "It's a good offer. By any practical measure, it's a very good offer." "I know," Clara said. "Security, position, no more boiling your hands raw every day." "I know that too." Ruth turned and looked at her directly. "But—" "I didn't say but. You didn't have to." Ruth dried her hands. "Clara, you're a smart woman, smart enough to know the difference between a good arrangement and a good life. The question is which one you think you deserve." Clara looked at the apron in her hands. The fabric was worn through at the pocket edge, and she'd been meaning to mend it for a week but kept forgetting. The kind of small thing you don't notice until you're standing still long enough to look. "I don't know yet," she said. "Well," Ruth said, "I'd figure it out before someone else figures it out for you." That evening, Clara walked back to Birch Lane in the dark, and she thought about Douglas Hale's clean, practical offer and about a kitchen garden with good soil and a little girl who had started saving her Sunday questions up all week so she'd have enough for one afternoon, and a man who poured coffee without measuring it, and had told her on a Saturday 3 weeks ago that she didn't have to be good at everything, she just had to be willing. She hadn't thought about it since he'd said it. She thought about it now. He had said it because Mara had been showing her how the ranch's accounts were kept, and Clara had made an error in the addition, a simple one, tired hands arithmetic, and had gotten visibly frustrated with herself. Silas had been watching from the doorway, and he'd said quietly, "You don't have to be good at everything. You just have to be willing to be wrong sometimes and fix it." It was such a simple thing to say. She had turned to look at him, and he had already moved on to something else, as if he hadn't said anything in particular. She walked the rest of the way home in the dark, and she did not have an answer yet. But she knew that the question was no longer the one she'd thought it was. The question was not Douglas Hale's offer, or Silas Granger's ranch, or Ruth Calloway's advice, or what the people of Redstone Crossing were saying about her. The question was what she actually wanted, for the first time in her life, now that wanting something was something she was allowed to do. That was harder than any of the rest of it. And the next Sunday, when she rode Butter out along the frozen track toward the ranch and saw smoke coming from the chimney and heard, before she'd even dismounted, the sound of Mara calling out to Eli about something urgent and probably not urgent at all, she sat on that horse for a moment before she tied it, and she let herself know what she knew. Then she went inside because the coffee was going to be too strong and someone had to tell him. The coffee was too strong again. Clara didn't say anything about it right away. She took the cup Silas handed her and sat down at the kitchen table and wrapped her hands around it, a habit she'd developed, the warmth before the taste, and let the familiar noise of the ranch settle around her. Mara was somewhere in the back of the house, loudly reorganizing something that hadn't asked to be reorganized. Eli was outside. She could hear the specific rhythm of him splitting kindling, methodical, patient, the same pace at the beginning as at the end, which was a very Eli thing to do. Silas sat down across from her with his own cup and looked at the window. "You're thinking about Hale's offer," he said. She looked at him. "Ruth told you." "Ruth tells me things she thinks I should know and lets me figure out what to do with them." He turned the cup in his hands. "I'm not asking you what you decided. That's not my business." "Then why bring it up?" "Because you've been quiet since you came in," he said, "and you're usually not." Clara looked at her coffee. "It's a good offer, by every practical measure." "I know what it is." "He's a reasonable man." "He is." "The house is—" "Clara." His voice was not sharp. It was just direct, the way he got when he decided to stop orbiting something. "I know what the house is. I know what he's offering." He set his cup down. "I'm not here to talk you out of it. I just wanted you to know, whatever you decide, the children are going to be all right. You've already done something for them that I couldn't have done on my own." He stopped, looked at her. "I needed you to know that." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment, except for the kindling outside and Mara moving furniture, or possibly just objects. It was hard to tell with Mara. "That sounds like a goodbye," Clara said. "It's not meant to." "Then what is it meant to be?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Silas Granger did not, she had learned, rush himself in conversation. He thought first, sometimes to the point where the other person had moved on before he was ready to speak. "It's meant to be honest," he finally said, "which I'm not always good at when it matters." She looked at him across the table. There was something careful happening in his face. Not hidden. Silas wasn't a man who hid things well, but held, like he had a hand on something and was deciding whether to let go. "Then be honest," she said. He looked out the window again, looked back. "I think about you being in that house," he said, "and I think about this house, and the difference between them isn't the size." He picked up his cup and then put it down without drinking. "That's all I can say right now. It's all I don't have the right to say more than that." Clara sat very still. The thing he had just said was small. It was also enormous. It was the kind of thing a man like Silas Granger would consider a declaration, even though most people would hear it as nothing. She knew that about him now. She had spent enough Sundays and Saturdays learning the way he communicated, in understatements that meant more than their surface, in things he did rather than things he said, in the specific quality of his silences. "Why don't you have the right?" she asked. "Because I haven't given you any reason to choose." He stopped, started again. "I haven't offered you anything. You paid for 2 nights at a hotel." "That's not what I mean." "I know it's not." She set her cup down. "Silas, ask me what you're trying to ask me." He looked at her then, fully, without the glance away that usually followed looking at her too directly. "I'm not ready to," he said. "Not today. I need—" He pressed one hand flat on the table, a gesture she'd seen him make when he was steadying himself against something. "I need to know that I'm asking for the right reason. Not because I'm afraid you're going to take Hale's offer. Not because the children need. Not for any of those reasons. What would the right reason be? She asked. He didn't answer that, but he didn't look away either. Mara came into the kitchen before anything else was said, carrying a small wooden box she had apparently decided needed to live somewhere different than it had been living, and she set it on the counter and looked at both of them with the assessing expression of a 9-year-old who knows she has walked into something and is working out what it is. Are you two fighting? She asked. No, they said at the same time. Mara looked at the 2 cups on the table. Neither of them finished. Okay, she said, with complete disbelief, and picked up her box and left. Clara left an hour after that, on butter, in the cold. She didn't have an answer for Douglas Hale. She didn't have a clear sense of what Silas was going to do or when or what she was supposed to do in the meantime. She had a small room on Birch Lane and raw hands and a kitchen garden she'd cleared on a ranch that didn't belong to her, and she was 25 years old in 1886 Wyoming, which meant that indecision was a luxury with a time limit on it. She sent Douglas Hale a note the following Thursday. She thanked him for his offer and told him she had decided not to accept it. She was as brief as she could be because she didn't want to explain her reasons, partly because they were complicated and partly because one of them was that the right answer was starting to clarify itself whether she was ready or not. And the note to Hale felt like the only decision she could actually make right now. The town knew by Friday. She wasn't surprised. Letters in Redstone Crossing were private in the way that rain was private. Everyone could see it coming and see where it landed. Hale was a well-known man, and she was a woman everyone had formed an opinion about, one way or another. And her refusal of his offer became something people discussed because it didn't fit the narrative they'd constructed. A woman with nothing turns down a man with plenty. That was interesting. That was the kind of interesting that required explanation. The explanation most people settled on was Silas Granger. She heard it at the wash house, where 2 women were talking in the low but not low enough voices of people who don't mind being overheard. She was behind the line of hanging sheets, and they didn't see her. She's chasing the Granger Ranch is what it is, one of them said. She knows Hale is set up and done, and Granger's land is younger, more to work with. Hale's house is 3 times the size of Granger's. But Granger's got children, and she's attached herself to the children first, which is the smart way to go about it. There was a pause. You think she's calculating all of it? I think a woman who has nothing left to go back to is always calculating. That's just practical. Clara stood behind the sheets and breathed very slowly in and out and felt the particular cold anger that comes not from being lied about, but from being half described. Because the irritating truth was that the woman wasn't entirely wrong about the practical part. Clara was practical. She had never pretended otherwise. But the part she was missing was the part that mattered, and there was nothing Clara could say about it without proving either the calculating woman theory or turning herself into something pathetic. She went back to work. She said nothing. That evening, she walked to Ruth's house instead of Birch Lane, which was not something she'd done before, but Ruth opened the door without surprise and brought out tea and sat down across from her and waited. People think I'm setting a trap, Clara said. Some people, Ruth said. They're not entirely wrong about my circumstances. No. Ruth wrapped both hands around her cup. But they're wrong about you. How do you know? Ruth looked at her. Because a calculating woman would have taken Hale's offer. A woman setting a trap doesn't turn down a sure thing for an uncertain one. She sipped her tea. You refused Hale because you didn't want Hale, which means you want something else, which means it's real. Clara stared at her cup. That doesn't make it simpler. No, Ruth said. Real things are usually complicated. She tilted her head slightly. What did Silas say when you told him about Hale? He said he thinks about me being in that house, and then he thinks about this house, and the difference isn't the size. Ruth was quiet for a moment, then she made a small sound. Not a laugh exactly, but adjacent to one. He said that? More or less? That man, Ruth said, with the tone of someone who has been exasperated by a person for a long time and has made peace with it. He had every chance to say something plain and simple, and instead She shook her head. He's been like that since I've known him. He says important things sideways. I know. Did you understand what he meant? Yes, Clara said. I just don't know what to do with it. Ruth set down her cup. Clara, what do you want? The question was simple. It was also the question she had been pushing around the edges of for weeks. looking at it from safe distances, refusing to stand directly in front of it because standing directly in front of something means you have to deal with what you see. I want... She stopped, started again. I want to plant that garden properly in the spring. I want Mara to stop saving all her questions for Sunday because she can ask them any day. I want... Her voice did something she hadn't intended, and she pressed her lips together for a moment. I want to not be afraid of wanting things anymore. That's what I want most. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Then don't be." It was 2 weeks after that conversation, on a Saturday afternoon in late January, when the thing she had been waiting for happened, except it didn't happen the way she'd imagined it. She had been imagining something private, something at the kitchen table with coffee, something deliberate and prepared. What actually happened was this. She and Silas were in the barn. Not romantic. The reason they were in the barn was that one of his 3 cows had been off her feed for 2 days, and Silas was worried about it in the way he worried about animals, quietly, consistently, until he'd resolved it. Clara had come out that Saturday to find him already in the barn when she arrived, crouched next to the cow in question, doing the kind of slow, patient examination that you do when you don't know what's wrong, and you're hoping your hands will tell you. She'd set down her things and come in without being asked, because that was what you did. She'd looked at the cow and suggested maybe the feed had gotten damp. She'd seen it happen at a neighbor's farm growing up. And Silas had looked at the feed and found that, yes, there was moisture at the bottom of the bin, probably a small roof leak they hadn't noticed. He'd relocated the feed. The cow had, after some persuasion, eaten. It wasn't exciting. It was just a problem solved. But afterward, they were both standing in the barn with the cold winter light coming through the gaps in the boards, and the cow was eating contentedly, and Silas looked at Clara with an expression she had not seen before. Not gratitude exactly, not the surprised look of someone who has been helped unexpectedly, but something older and less easily named, like recognition. "I want to ask you something," he said. His voice was different. She felt it before she processed it consciously. A change in register, a weight. "All right," she said. He looked at the cow for a moment. She had come to understand this, his looking away, as a preparatory gesture, not avoidance. He was organizing himself. "I've been doing this alone for 5 years," he said. "Every decision, every broken thing, every night they have bad dreams, and every morning they need something I don't know how to give them." He paused. "I'm not complaining about it. I made choices that led to it being this way, and I'd make most of them again. But I've been..." He stopped, looked at her. "Tired. I have been very tired for a long time." She said nothing. She was listening in the way she had learned to listen to him, all the way through, not preparing her response. "When you're here," he said, "I don't carry the whole thing by myself. That's..." He pressed his hand flat against the barn wall, that steadying gesture. "I don't know how else to say it. I've tried to find more words for it, and I can't. When you're here, it's different. And when you're not here, I notice that it's different." He met her eyes. "I would like to ask you to be here. Not just Saturdays and Sundays, permanently. As my wife, if you'd have me. Not because we need a woman on the ranch, not because the children are attached to you, although they are, and I won't pretend that doesn't matter, but because..." He stopped and something went through his face that was almost pain. "I believe we could make something real here. I think we already have. I just want to do it properly." The barn was very quiet. The cow moved slightly, and the sound was enormous in the silence. Clara looked at Silas Granger. She thought about what Ruth had said. You refused Hale because you didn't want Hale. And about the question she had been living with for weeks. And about what she had told Ruth she wanted. The list of specific true things she had said out loud in a way that had surprised even her. She also thought about the fear. Because it was there. She would have been lying if she'd said it wasn't. The fear that loneliness could disguise itself. The fear that need and love were not the same thing, and that she might be confusing them. The fear of choosing something and being wrong and not having the resources to survive being wrong. "I need to ask you something first," she said. "Anything." "Do you know why you're asking me?" She kept her voice level. "Not the children. Not the ranch. Not because Hale offered and you didn't like the idea of that. Do you know the actual reason?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you stood in Harold Fenwick's office with nothing and you walked out with your spine straight," he said. "Because you told Eli he was right And me, I was wrong about the flower vendor, in the same sentence, in that order, and you were correct on both counts. Because you cleared that garden in 3 hours in January cold, because you could see what it could be, not what it was. He paused. Because I have been carrying something for 5 years that I don't have a name for, and when you're here it weighs less. And I think that might be the most honest thing I can tell you. She looked at him for a long time. I'm not easy to live with, she said. I have opinions about things that are none of my business. I'll tell you when I think you're wrong. I'm not... She stopped. I'm not a replacement for what you had before. I'm not asking for a replacement, he said. I'm asking for you. There was a particular quality to that sentence. It was so direct and so stripped of decoration that it landed harder than something elaborate would have. I'm asking for you, not a role, not a function, not a practical arrangement. Her. Clara Winslow, with the $3.40 and the worn apron and the opinions and the fear she was still working through. She opened her mouth. And then the barn door opened, and Mara came in with her coat half buttoned and snow starting in her hair, because it had apparently begun snowing sometime in the last few minutes, and nobody had told it to wait. Eli says supper won't make itself, Mara announced. Then she stopped, looked at both of them with the same assessing expression she'd had in the kitchen 2 weeks ago. Are you fighting again? We're not fighting, Silas said. You have the same faces. Mara, Clara said. What? Clara looked at her. This 9-year-old girl with her dark hair going damp from the snow and her half-buttoned coat and her serious, watchful face, and felt something shift in a way she hadn't expected. Not a decision, something before a decision, a certainty that arrived before the words. Go tell Eli I'll start supper in a few minutes, Clara said. Mara looked at her father, then at Clara. Something moved across her face, quick, careful, like she was trying not to want something too visibly. Okay, she said. She turned and went out. The barn door closed. Silas looked at Clara. She doesn't carry the whole world by herself when you're here either, he said. It was not what she expected him to say. His voice was low. She tries to. She's been trying since her mother. She thinks I need her to. He stopped. But when you're here, she stops trying so hard. She's 9. She's just 9 when you're here. That was the one that did it. Not his words to her. Not the specificity of his reasons, as careful and true as they were. It was that sentence. She's just 9 when you're here. Because Clara knew what it cost a child to be older than they were supposed to be. And she knew what it looked like when someone gave that child permission to put the weight down. She had been that child, a long time ago. She looked at her hands, red from the cold now, still rough from the wash-house work she'd be going back to on Monday. Hands that had learned to find a use for themselves in any circumstance. And she thought about loneliness disguising itself as love, and she tested the question one more time. Was this loneliness, or was this something else? The answer came back the same way it had been coming back every Sunday for 2 months, clear and quiet, and not particularly interested in her fear. I need you to understand something, she said. Tell me. I'm not choosing this because I need somewhere to go, she said. I have somewhere to go. I have a room on Birch Lane and work at Ruth's place, and I can manage. She met his eyes. I'm choosing this because I want it. Because I want you and those children and this barn and that garden, and I want it as a person who is choosing, not a person who is settling. She took a breath. That distinction matters to me. It matters very much. It matters to me too, he said. It's part of why I asked. She nodded, slowly. Then yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. It wasn't a grand moment. The cow was eating. Snow was sifting in through the gap above the barn door. Silas Granger looked at her with an expression that she would spend years afterward finding different words for. Relief was part of it, and something much older than relief underneath, like a person who has been braced against impact and has been given permission to stop. He didn't cross the barn and take her hands or make a speech. He exhaled once, long and slow, and said, All right, she agreed. Then she said, The coffee, you never measure it. I know how much I like. The amount you like is too much. That's a difference of opinion. It's a difference between a preference and a fact, she said. We can discuss it. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. It never was quite a smile with him, more of an acknowledgement that something funny had occurred in the vicinity. You said you had opinions about things that weren't your business. The coffee is going to be my business now, she said. He made a sound then that she realized she hadn't heard before. A short, low, genuine sound that might have been a laugh. It startled her slightly. It startled him slightly too, she thought, from the way his expression shifted. She walked out of the barn ahead of him toward the house, where the snow was coming down properly now, covering the ruts in the yard and the dead growth in the garden and all the evidence of deferred things. And she thought, spring. The garden in spring. The soil she knew was still good under all of it. The things that could still grow. Eli was standing on the porch watching the snow. He looked at Clara when she came up the steps, with the particular look he sometimes gave her, the measuring and finding, satisfactory look. "You're staying for supper?" he asked. "I'm staying," she said. Something shifted in his face, small, controlled, in the way that Eli controlled everything, but real. He nodded once, moved toward the door. "Eli," Silas said, coming up behind. Eli turned. Silas looked at his son. "Clara's going to stay, longer than supper." Eli was 7 and old in the way some 7-year-olds are old, the ones who have been paying attention through hard things. He looked at his father and then at Clara. And he did the math the way she had seen him do math, quickly, correctly, without showing all the work. "Okay," he said. Then, after a pause, in the voice he reserved for things that mattered. "Good." He went inside. The three of them stood on the porch in the falling snow for a moment, Silas and Clara, and the space where Mara would come back when she found out supper wasn't started yet. And none of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said right then that wasn't already being said by the fact of them standing there. Then Mara's voice came from inside the house, indignant and carrying, "Why is nobody making supper? I specifically said—" Clara went inside. The town found out about the engagement the same way the town found out about everything, in pieces and from different directions until the picture assembled itself. Ruth heard it first because Silas told her directly, which Clara suspected was his way of ensuring she heard it correctly before the other versions arrived. Ruth came to the wash house the next Monday morning and looked at Clara without saying anything for a long moment, and then she said, "Good," in the same tone Eli had used, which Clara found both funny and moving. What the town said was less simple. Some of it was warm. There were people in Redstone Crossing who had watched Silas manage alone for 5 years and thought it was too long, and who had seen Clara come from nothing and build something and thought she had earned a good outcome. Mrs. Hadley at the dry goods store pressed a small wrapped parcel of hard candy into Clara's hands the morning she heard, without comment, which Clara understood as a particular form of blessing. But some of the town was not warm. The two women from behind the sheets did not become warmer simply because their theory had been proven wrong. In fact, the theory shifted to accommodate the new facts, and now it was Silas who was the calculating one, accepting a woman with nothing because he needed labor and company, and Clara who was foolish for accepting an uncertain future over a secure one. The whispers reorganized around the new shape of things. Silas heard some of it. She knew because his jaw was doing a particular thing one Saturday when she arrived. A held tightness, the sign of something he was not going to mention unless she asked. She asked. He told her briefly what he'd overheard at the feed store. He said he didn't care what they thought. "You do a little," she said, not unkindly. He looked at her. "A little," he admitted. "Not enough to change anything." "Good." She hung her coat on the hook inside the door. Because people who haven't made anything tend to have opinions about people who are in the middle of making something. It's easier to criticize a process than to trust an outcome. He looked at her for a long moment. "Where did you get that?" "Ruth said something like it," she said. "I improved it." The improvement on his face was slight but genuine. What she didn't tell him was that the whispers bothered her too. Not the ones that questioned her motives. She had made her peace with those, mostly, because she knew what her motives were, and the people saying those things didn't, and she couldn't control what people did with the gap. What bothered her was a specific kind, the ones that questioned his judgment, that Silas Granger was a man so ground down by 5 years of grief and work that he'd take whatever comfort came to hand and call it love, that a man raising 2 children alone wasn't thinking clearly about what he needed, that she was something that had happened to him rather than something he had chosen. Those bothered her because she could not entirely dismiss them without knowing fully and completely what he felt. And Silas was not a man who narrated his feelings. He demonstrated them, one quiet action at a time, and she had learned to read them. She was getting good at reading them. But there was still a part of her that sat with the fear at night in her room on Birch Lane and went, what if? What if this was grief making itself look like something else? What if she was filling a shape someone else had left? What if she was confusing his steadiness for affection and his practicality for caring and the children's love for his? She sat with those questions, and she did not have clean answers for all of them. She was not sure anyone ever did, going into something this large. She thought about what Ruth had said. Real things are usually complicated. She thought about her own hands, red and certain and not particularly gentle. And she thought about the garden in spring. She thought about him saying, "I'm asking for you," in a barn while snow started and a cow ate contentedly and the air smelled like cold hay. The fear didn't disappear, but it stopped being the loudest thing. The date was set for March. The town's reaction to that news was its own small storm, but by then Clara had stopped measuring the weather by what Redstone Crossing thought of it and started measuring it by what she could see directly in front of her. Two children who were doing better than they had been, a man who slept less badly than before according to Eli, who noticed everything, a garden with good soil waiting under the last of the winter, and a life that was assembling itself from pieces she had not planned and could not have predicted, but that felt more than anything she had built or held or managed before in her 25 years, like something that was actually, genuinely hers. She went to the Monday morning and tied on her worn apron and put her hands in the hot water and thought, March. Ruth looked up from the other tub. "You're smiling," she said. "I know," Clara said. "First time I've seen that." "I know that too." Ruth turned back to her work. After a moment, she said very quietly, "Good." March in Wyoming is not a gentle month. It arrives with the memory of winter still in it, cold mornings that try to convince you February hasn't ended, afternoons that sometimes relent enough to let you believe spring is a real thing and not something you invented to get through January. The ground is half frozen and half mud, and the light is longer but not yet warm, and everything has the quality of something that has been waiting a long time and is not quite ready to stop waiting. Clara Winslow became Clara Granger on the 14th of March in the front room of the Redstone Crossing Courthouse, in front of a justice of the peace named Walter Briggs, who had performed so many of these that he could do it in his sleep, and probably sometimes did. There were 4 people present besides Briggs: Silas, Clara, Ruth Calloway, and Eli, who had been given the solemn responsibility of holding the small bunch of dried flowers that Mara had assembled from things she found in the barn and insisted were appropriate, and who held them with the gravity of someone carrying something fragile and important. Mara was not there. She had decided the night before that she did not want to come, and had said so in the flat. Certain tones she used when she had made a decision she knew was going to be questioned and had prepared herself for the questioning. Silas had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "All right," and that was all. He told Clara about it on the way to town that morning, his voice even, not pressing her to react any particular way. It's not about you," he said. "I don't think." "I know," Clara said. Silas. She looked at him from the seat beside him on the wagon. "She's 9 years old and she already lost one mother. I'd be more worried if she came willingly." He was quiet for a moment. "She's going to be difficult about it." "Probably. For a while." "Yes." Clara watched the road. "I can manage difficult. I've done harder things than earn a 9-year-old's trust." He didn't say anything to that, but she felt something shift in the air between them, a small release of tension she hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The ceremony took 8 minutes. Walter Briggs had a cold and kept nearly sneezing at inopportune moments, but managed to hold it together through the important parts. Eli presented the flowers when asked with such enormous seriousness that Ruth, who was not a woman who cried easily, had to look at the ceiling for a moment. Silas said the words. Briggs prompted him to say, and his voice was low and steady, and he looked at Clara while he said them, which she would remember, that he looked at her, not at Briggs or the window or the floor, but directly at her, with the face of a man who was saying something he meant. She said her own words and meant them too. The fear was still there, small and honest, the way it should be when you are doing something large. She had decided that its presence was not a warning. It was just the acknowledgement that this mattered. Briggs pronounced them married. Eli exhaled with the relief of someone who has been holding his breath professionally. Ruth shook Silas's hand and then hugged Clara briefly. Ruth was not a prolonged hugger. It was a quick, certain clasp, and said quietly into her ear, "You did the right thing." "I know," Clara said. "I'm not just saying that. I know that too." They ate lunch at Dot's place, the same restaurant where Silas had bought Clara stew 4 months ago, a fact that was not lost on either of them and was not mentioned, which made it more present. Eli had soup. Silas ordered too much and ate most of it, which was different from usual, and Clara thought he was probably running on something other than hunger. Ruth ordered coffee and a piece of pie and said that the pie was acceptable, which from Ruth was high praise. Then they went home. All 4 of them, in the wagon, on the half-frozen mud road out to the Granger Ranch. Clara sitting next to Silas up front, Eli in the back with the dried flowers, which he was still holding because nobody had told him he could stop. She had moved most of her things the previous Saturday. There had not been many things to move. What fit in a satchel, coming in, still mostly fit in a satchel going out, with the addition of a few items she'd acquired over the months. An extra dress, a pair of work boots she'd bought with her 3rd week's wages from Ruth, a small tin of sewing supplies, a book she'd found at the back of the dry goods store for a nickel that she'd never finished but kept meaning to. That was it. That was everything she owned. Vera had watched her go with a warmth that Clara hadn't expected, given that Vera was generally a quiet woman who did not make large gestures. She had pressed a jar of preserved plums into Clara's hands at the door and said, "For your first winter there, if they run low on preserves." Clara had looked at the jar and felt something unexpected move through her. Not sentiment exactly, but the specific warmth of being seen by someone who has watched you survive something and is acknowledging it without making a ceremony of it. She had hugged Vera, which surprised them both. Now she came home to the Granger Ranch as Clara Granger, and Mara was waiting on the porch, and the reunion was not smooth. Mara was standing with her arms crossed and an expression that was trying to be neutral and was not succeeding. She watched the wagon come up the track and watched her father help Clara down. An automatic gesture on his part, offered without thought, and Clara noticed that it was automatic, which told her something. And she watched Eli come around the back with his flowers, and she said nothing until everyone had reached the porch. Then she said to no one in particular, "I made supper." Silas looked at her. "What did you make?" "Beans. And I put something in them, but I don't know what it's called. It was a brown powder." "Cumin," Clara said. Mara looked at her. "Is that what it was?" From the small on the second shelf, "Yes. It's cumin. It'll be good in beans." Clara held her gaze. Not challenging, not placating, just steady. "Thank you for making supper." Something flickered in Mara's face. The arms stayed crossed. "I'm not doing it because it's a special occasion," she said. "I was hungry." "That's as good a reason as any," Clara said. They ate the beans, which were genuinely good. Mara had better instincts in the kitchen than she knew, which was true of several things about her. Eli said so. Silas said so. Clara said it too, directly, and without the cushioning that sometimes makes a compliment feel like it's trying too hard. "These are well seasoned," she said. "You've got a good nose for it." Mara said nothing, but she ate an extra helping. The first week was careful. That was the word for it. Careful. The house had its patterns, the rhythms that had built up over 5 years of Silas managing alone with 2 children, and Clara moved around them the way you move around furniture in an unfamiliar room in the dark. Slowly, with your hands out, trying not to knock anything over. She did not try to change things immediately. She watched how mornings worked. She watched what Silas did before she was awake, which was considerable. He was up before light, always, and by the time she came downstairs there was already coffee made and whatever livestock needed attending had been attended. She watched what the children expected and what they dreaded, and what made Mara go quiet in that particular way that meant she was processing something difficult. What she did change, she changed quietly and practically, without announcement. The feed storage in the barn was not organized well. Things got damp. So she reorganized it one afternoon while Silas was in the north field, not asking permission because it needed doing, and she knew how. When he came back and saw it, he looked at it for a moment and said, "The bins were rotated. It was not a question. The left side gets moisture from the east wall, she said. If you keep the grain there, it goes bad at the bottom before you notice. He looked at the reorganized barn. I lost feed to that twice last year. I know, you mentioned it in November. Butter's still in the left stall, which is fine, but the grain needs to stay right. He was quiet for a moment, in the specific way that meant he was taking something in. All right, he said. That was how most of it went. Not dramatic, not friction-free either. There were moments in those first weeks where two people who both had their own ways of doing things ran into each other around corners. She put the account ledger in a different place because the original place made no logical sense, and she couldn't find it when she needed it, and Silas came looking for it without asking first and couldn't find it. And there were two terse sentences exchanged about it that lasted approximately 45 seconds and ended with her telling him where it was, and him going to get it, and both of them choosing, without discussion, to consider the matter closed. She learned that he was difficult about money, not in the way of a man who didn't want to spend it, but in the way of a man who had spent years being careful about it and had built habits of anxiety around it that weren't always rational. He would put off buying something needed, a tool that had broken, a length of rope that had worn through, longer than was practical, and when she pointed this out the first time, he got defensive in the specific way of someone who knows you're right but isn't ready to say so yet. She let it sit. He bought the rope 2 days later without mentioning it. She learned that Eli processed everything internally first and then came to her with a finished thought, usually at an unexpected moment. She would be wringing out laundry she'd brought home to do, or she'd be in the kitchen and he would appear in the doorway and say something like, I think the north pasture fence is going to need attention before the spring thaw or we'll lose it. And she would realize he had been carrying this observation for 3 days and had worked out his entire position on it before bringing it to her rather than his father, which she turned over in her mind for a while before understanding. He brought it to her because he had decided she would take it seriously without making him feel like a child for noticing. She took it seriously. She told Silas about the fence. Silas went and looked at the fence and said, Eli was right. The fence got repaired before the thaw. After that, Eli came to her with things more regularly. Mara was slower. Mara was the thing Clara thought about most carefully, which Mara probably knew, because Mara was the kind of child who knew when she was being thought about carefully and found it irritating rather than comforting. She wanted not to be managed. She wanted to simply be encountered, on her own terms, without anyone making special accommodations for the fact of her loss or her age or her stubbornness. Clara figured this out approximately 10 days in and adjusted. She stopped being careful around Mara. Not careless. Careful was still necessary. You were still dealing with a 9-year-old. But she stopped the particular quality of carefulness that signals to a child that they are being handled. She started just talking to Mara the way she talked to anyone, directly, without simplifying, allowing for the possibility of disagreement. The shift happened around something small. It was a Tuesday morning and Clara was working on the account ledger. She had taken it over quietly because she was better at numbers than Silas, and they both knew it. And Mara came and looked over her shoulder without asking. That column's wrong, Mara said. Clara looked at the column. Mara was right. It is, she said. Good catch. Mara looked slightly thrown by the directness of this. She'd been expecting perhaps something softer or more defensive. My mother used to do the accounts, she said. Clara kept her voice even. She was good at it? She said numbers were the only thing that didn't argue back. Clara looked at the column she was correcting. She was right about that. Mara stood there for a moment, then she pulled out the chair next to Clara and sat down. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, close enough to see the ledger, and watched Clara work. That was how it started. Not with conversation, not with the kind of bonding moment that gets remembered with clean edges. Just a chair pulled out at a table, a child deciding, silently, that this was a space she was allowed to occupy. Clara did not comment on it. She just moved the ledger slightly toward the center of the table so Mara could see it better. The garden was its own process. She had planned for spring since January. Since the afternoon she had cleared the dead growth and turned the cold soil and felt the quality of what was underneath. She had made notes through the winter. Not formal plans, just a list in the back of her mind of what the soil was right for, what the household needed, what would take, and what wouldn't. She started the seeds in late March, in small boxes by the kitchen window that Mara watched with escalating impatience. Nothing's happening, Mara said on day 4. Things are happening underground, Clara said. You just can't see them yet. How do you know? Because that's what seeds do. The part you can see is never the first part. Mara looked at the boxes with suspicion. How long? Depends on the seed. Some of these, she pointed to a row of small markers she'd made from notched sticks, will be up in a week. Some will take 3. What if they don't come up? Then we plant again. Clara looked at her. That's what you do when something doesn't take. You don't give up on the soil. You try again. Mara was quiet. Clara had a sense, not for the first time, that they were talking about more than seeds. She didn't push it. You didn't push things with Mara. You said the true thing and let her take it at her own pace. 7 days later, Mara came downstairs in the morning before Clara had made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and said, in a voice that was trying not to sound excited and failing, "Something's up." Clara came and looked. 3 small green shoots, impossibly thin, leaning toward the window light. "That's the lettuce," Clara said. "Fastest grower." "It's very small." "It'll get bigger." Mara looked at the shoots for a long moment. "Can I water them?" "Every other day. Too much water drowns them." "I know that," Mara said, which she hadn't known 3 weeks ago, but Clara let it stand. April was harder than March, which surprised her. She had expected the adjustment to get easier as time passed, and in some ways it did. The practical rhythms became more natural, the friction around habits and spaces reduced. But April brought its own complications. The first was money. Silas's careful anxiety about it turned out to have a specific shape she hadn't fully understood until she was inside the household accounts. The ranch was solvent, but only barely, and the margin they were working in was narrower than she'd realized. There was debt. Not catastrophic debt, but the kind that sat on a place and constrained every decision, from equipment purchased before his wife died, from a year when the cattle prices had dropped and he'd had to borrow against the following season. He hadn't told her the full amount before the wedding. Not dishonestly, she understood that, but because he was a man who had been managing something alone so long, he'd forgotten it was possible to share the weight of knowing. She found it in the accounts herself, on an evening in early April when she was going through the full ledger rather than the current year pages. She sat at the table for a while with the number in front of her. Then she went and found Silas in the barn, where he was repairing a harness, and she said, "I found the full account." He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his face had something in it, not quite shame, but adjacent. "I should have told you." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He set the harness down. "It's manageable. I know it's manageable. I worked it out. If we extend the south pasture and bring in another 2 heads of cattle by fall, the income from next spring covers the balance with room left over." She sat down on a hay bale. "I'm not angry about the debt. I'm telling you that I need to know the full thing, not the part you think I can handle. The full thing." He looked at her for a moment. "That's fair." "It is." She met his eyes. "I came into this as a partner, Silas, not as someone you have to manage the information for. If we're going to build something here, I need to see all of it, even the parts that are hard to show." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, the held quality gone, something younger in it, something that had been kept behind a door for a long time. "I've been handling things alone for so long," he said, "that I don't always know when I'm doing it out of necessity and when I'm doing it out of habit." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you now instead of being angry about it later." He nodded slowly. "There's also something with the north boundary," he said. "A dispute with the Marsh family about where the line falls. It's been—" He stopped. "I've been handling it." "Tell me about the north boundary," she said. He told her. It took 40 minutes and covered 2 seasons of unresolved conflict with the neighboring Marsh family over a fence line that Silas believed was in the wrong place and Thomas Marsh believed was exactly right. It was a conflict with the specific stubborn quality of boundary disputes. Both sides had some evidence for their position, neither side wanted to concede, and the longer it went unresolved, the more entrenched both positions became. Clara listened to all of it. Then she said, "Has anyone looked at the original survey?" Silas blinked. The original land survey, from when the parcels were first registered." She looked at him. "If there's a record of the original boundary line, it doesn't matter what either of you believes. The record is the record." He stared at her. That survey would be at the county land office. Yes, she said. I didn't. He stopped. I've been so focused on what Marsh was saying and what I was saying that I didn't think to go back before either of us. That's what arguments do, she said. They make you forget there's a before. He looked at her with the recognition expression, the one she'd first seen in the barn the afternoon of the sick cow, and that she had come to understand as the look he got when something genuinely surprised him. I'll go to the county office, he said. I'll go, she said. I have Ruth's wagon available Tuesday, and I know the clerk there. I helped him find a misplaced file last November. He owes me a small favor. Silas looked at her for a moment. You know the county clerk. I know most people in Redstone Crossing, she said. I spent 4 months walking those streets with nothing to do but pay attention. He made the almost laugh sound again. She was getting good at timing it. She went to the county office on Tuesday and came back with a copy of the original survey, and the original survey put the boundary line exactly where Silas said it was, and not where Thomas Marsh said it was. She brought the copy to Silas and watched him go through it twice, slowly, with the focus of a man who needs to be sure before he's sure. That's it, he said. That's the line. Yes. Marsh has to move his fence. He won't like it, she said. No, he set the survey down, but it's not his line to draw. She went with Silas to speak with Thomas Marsh the following Saturday. She had suggested going together not because Silas needed protecting. He didn't. He was solid in a confrontation. His quietness worked for him in those situations because people tend to underestimate quiet men and then find they have misjudged. But because she had a feeling, based on what Silas had told her, that Marsh was a man who responded to witness, to being seen in his decision-making by someone who was paying attention. Marsh was not a bad man. He was a man who had convinced himself he was right and built a considerable amount of emotional investment on top of that conviction. And when the survey was laid on his kitchen table, he went through the stages of that conviction being dismantled in real time. First the objection, then the alternative explanation, then the silence, then the concession that came out sideways as, well, if that's what the survey shows. It is, Clara said pleasantly, and we understand it's a change. We're willing to give you time to move the fence rather than requiring it immediately. Marsh looked at her. He'd been looking at Silas for the whole conversation, the way men of his generation sometimes directed everything toward the man in the room, and Clara's speaking directly had recalibrated something in his attention. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks is fine, she said. On the way back, Silas didn't say much for the first mile. Then, you gave him the time. He needed a door to walk through, she said. If you back a person completely into a corner, they'll fight the corner even when they've already lost the argument. Give them a small way to feel dignified about agreeing and they'll take it. He looked at the road. Where did you learn that? Managing without power, she said. When you can't force something, you have to find the angle that makes the other person want to cooperate. She glanced at him. It's not manipulation. It's just understanding that people need room. He was quiet again. Then, you're going to be good at this. At what? All of it, he said. Not elaborating, just all of it. She looked at the road ahead. The land was showing green now, early and tentative but real, the hills doing the thing they did in spring, where you could see the change happening day by day if you paid attention. The mountains were still carrying snow at the top, but the lower slopes had softened, and the light was longer in the evenings, and the mud on the road was the mud of thaw rather than of freeze. She thought about all of it, about the ledger and the north boundary, and Mara's chair pulled up to the table, and Eli's careful dispatches, and the seeds in the kitchen window boxes that were coming up now, 4 rows of them, ordered and small and certain. She thought about the deferred gate that she had asked Pete, the ranch hand who came 3 days a week, to fix last Thursday, and that was now fixed. About the porch step that she had replaced herself on a Tuesday afternoon with a piece of wood that was exactly the right width. She thought about arriving in this town with $3.40 and nowhere to go and sitting on hotel steps while the Wyoming wind argued with her coat. She thought about a small boy with a serious face asking why she looked so alone. Silas, she said. The day we met, you said you almost didn't stop. He was quiet for a moment. I almost didn't. What made you? He held the reins in both hands, looking at the road. I had stopped once before, he said, when Margaret was sick. There was a day near the end when she needed something from me. Not medicine, not practical help, just she needed me to be present with her in a way I didn't know how to do. I had been managing everything, the ranch, the children, her care, and I had been managing it by staying in the moving part of my mind, the part that makes lists and solves problems, and she needed me to stop moving for a minute and just be there. He paused. I didn't. I said I had to check on something. I don't remember what. And she died 2 days later, and that was the last real conversation we could have had. He kept his eyes on the road. I have thought about that conversation every day since. The road was quiet. A bird somewhere. The sound of the horses. So when I saw you on those steps, he said, I started to walk past. And then I thought, I am not going to be the person who walks past again. Even if it costs me something, I'm not doing that again. He glanced at her briefly. It didn't cost me anything. It turned out to be the opposite of a cost. He looked back at the road. But I didn't know that then. Clara sat with that for a while. The wagon moved, the spring land moved around them. I'm glad you stopped, she said. So am I, he said. That was all. No more was needed. The garden came up through April in stages. The lettuce first, then the beans, then the slower things that had been doing their underground work since March, and finally decided the conditions were acceptable. Mara was in it every other day, watering with the measured care of someone who has been told too much water drowns things and has taken this very seriously. She pulled weeds without being asked. She made a small marker for each row in her own handwriting, more careful than her usual handwriting, the handwriting of someone who wants the markers to last. Clara worked beside her on the weekends and sometimes in the evenings after supper, when the light held long enough. They did not always talk while they worked. Sometimes they did. Mara had questions that came out while her hands were busy in a way they didn't come out otherwise, like the physical occupation of gardening unlocked something in her. She asked about Clara's childhood once, in a sideways way, and Clara told her the honest version, the mother who died, the father who left, the years of managing on other people's margins before learning to manage on her own. Mara listened. Then she said, Did you think you'd ever have a family again? Clara considered the question seriously, the way Mara required. I thought it was something other people had, she said. I'd gotten used to thinking it wasn't for me. What changed? Clara looked at the garden, at the green rows and the careful markers and the soil she had cleared in January cold when it was just bones and potential. I stopped deciding in advance what was possible, she said. Mara turned this over, then she went back to weeding, but something in her had shifted. Clara could feel it in the quality of the silence, the way it had become a thinking silence rather than a holding back silence. 3 days later, Mara came to Clara in the kitchen at 7 in the morning before Silas was up, sat down at the table without being invited, and said, I'm not going to call you Mother. I just want you to know that now. I know, Clara said. I'm not asking you to. Some people will think that's strange. Some people think a lot of things that aren't their business. Mara looked at her. Something worked in her face, complicated, real, young and old at the same time. I don't want to forget her, she said. You won't, Clara said. Remembering her doesn't take anything away from what's here. There's room for both. Mara looked at her hands on the table. Do you promise? It was the first time she had asked Clara for anything directly. The words sat between them, quiet and enormous. Yes, Clara said. I promise. Mara nodded once, the nod of someone who has received information they intend to hold on to. She got up. She went to the window and looked at the garden. Then she said, without turning around, The beans need water today. I know, Clara said. I was going to do it after breakfast. I'll do it, Mara said, and went to get her coat. Clara sat at the kitchen table and did not say anything, and did not make it into a moment, because Mara would not have wanted it made into a moment. She just sat there and let the morning come in through the kitchen window and thought about room, how there was more of it than you expected when you stopped being afraid to look for it. Silas found her still sitting there when he came down 20 minutes later. He looked at her. He looked at the garden where Mara was moving between the rows with a small watering can. He looked back at Clara. She watered the garden, he said. She said it needed it. He poured his coffee, too much, as always, and sat down across from her. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She could see it in him, the thing he'd been carrying, setting down slightly. Not gone, just lighter. The way a weight feels different when someone else has a hand on it. Outside, Mara moved between the bean rows with her careful, measuring steps, watering each plant with the exactness of someone who has taken a responsibility seriously and intends to honor it. The morning light was long and pale over the valley, and the mountains were holding their last snow at the peaks, and somewhere further up the track, Eli would be starting on whatever he'd decided needed doing before breakfast, methodical and certain, the way he did everything. Clara drank her coffee, too strong, as always, and she still hadn't fixed that, and looked at her husband across the kitchen table of the house that was becoming, gradually and imperfectly and without ceremony, hers. The summer that followed was the hardest working season Clara had ever known, and she had known some hard ones. It was not hard in the way that suffering is hard, not the gray grinding endurance of those first weeks at the wash house, hands in hot water, back bent, counting coins in her head. This was a different kind. The heart of building, the heart of a body pushed to its limit on something it has chosen, which is a completely different exhaustion from the heart of a body pushed on something it's trapped in. She would not have traded it. She knew that clearly by the end of July, when she sat on the porch in the evening, too tired to talk, and Silas sat beside her equally silent, and they watched the light go out of the sky together without needing to fill the quiet. They had extended the south pasture through June, which meant fencing, which meant post holes, which meant Silas and Pete the ranch hand and Eli, who was 8 now, and had decided he was equal to adult work and was not entirely wrong, working the ground while Clara coordinated the materials and kept the account of what they spent against what they had. She had developed a system for the accounts that Silas initially viewed with some skepticism because it was different from how he'd done it, and then adopted without comment when it turned out to save him 2 hours of head-scratching per month. The 2 additional cattle came in late June, a transaction she had helped negotiate because she had been right about knowing people in Redstone Crossing, and the man selling was a man whose wife bought preserved goods from Clara's excess garden production, and that small connection had created a margin of goodwill that translated into a fair price. Silas had watched her work that negotiation, the same way he'd watched her with Thomas Marsh in the spring, with the focused attention of someone learning something they hadn't expected to need to learn. "You do that differently than I do," he said, on the way home with the cattle trailing behind the wagon. "I don't have the size to do it your way," she said, "so I found another way. It works better. For me it does. Your way works for you." She looked at him. "The point isn't to do it the same. The point is that it gets done." He thought about this. "I've been trying to do everything the same way for 5 years," he said. "My way, because it was the way I knew." "I know. It was slower and harder." "Yes, yet," as she said. "It was." He was quiet. Then, "I wasted some time." "You survived," she said. "That's not waste. That's what you had available." She watched the new cattle move. "You have something different available now." He nodded, slowly, the nod of a man absorbing something at a deeper level than conversation usually reached. The garden through that summer became the thing that grounded Clara when the rest of the season's demands threatened to scatter her. It was not a beautiful garden. She was too practical for beautiful, and the soil had its own opinions about what it would and wouldn't do. But it was productive in the real, tangible sense that the household ate from it through June and July and August, and still had enough left over that she began trading the surplus. Preserved beans to Mrs. Hadley at the dry goods store, who stocked a small selection of local goods and was fair about what she paid. Excess squash to Dot, whose restaurant was always looking for local supply. A regular arrangement with 2 other families on neighboring properties for whom she grew specific things. Dill, which one family needed for their own preserving, a particular variety of dry bean the other had been buying expensive from a catalog. It was Mara who suggested the catalog bean. She had been reading the catalog in question. She read everything that came into the house, catalogs included, with the thoroughness of someone who cannot understand why anyone would leave information unexplored. And she had found the variety and looked at the price and come to Clara with the catalog open and her finger on the price and said, "The Haverfields pay this for these? We could grow these." Clara had looked at the price, then at Mara. "How do you know the Haverfields need them?" "Mrs. Haverfield told Mrs. Hadley and I was in the store," Mara said. She said she wished someone local grew them. Were you listening to a conversation that wasn't meant for you? Mara met her eyes without flinching. I was present in a public space. Clara looked at the catalog price again. Then she looked at her garden plot and did the calculation. We'd need to expand the east bed, she said, and the yield isn't guaranteed first season. The soil would need amending. I know where there's good compost, Mara said. The pile by the old fence. It's been sitting 2 years. It's ready. Clara looked at her. This 10-year-old with the serious face and her mother's practicality and her father's stubbornness and something entirely her own underneath both, and felt the specific warmth of being surprised by someone you already thought you understood. All right, Clara said, show me the compost pile. The Haverfield bean arrangement paid for the new harness Silas had been putting off buying for 8 months. Mara knew this because Clara told her directly, with the account book open between them on the kitchen table. She did not soften the numbers or simplify the explanation. Mara sat with the numbers and understood them and asked 2 sharp questions about the following season's projection, and then sat back with an expression that was trying not to be proud and not entirely succeeding. You did the Haverfield calculation, Clara told her. That's where the harness came from. We did it together, Mara said. You found the opportunity. I just did the math. Mara looked at the account book. Dad never showed me the accounts. He didn't know you wanted to see them. He didn't ask. No, Clara said. He doesn't always know to ask about the things that aren't obvious. That's not a flaw exactly. It's just he manages what's in front of him. He sometimes needs someone to bring him what's around the corner. She paused. You're good at seeing around corners. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, are you going to teach me the whole system? If you want to learn it. I do. Then yes. That was how the Tuesday afternoon account lessons began. Not scheduled, not formal, just Mara appearing at the kitchen table on Tuesday afternoons when her other work was done, and Clara sliding the book to the middle, and the two of them going through it together. Silas knew about it. He said nothing, which was his way of saying he approved of something more than he knew how to express. The summer also brought the resolution of a thing that had been sitting under the surface since March, which was Harold Fenwick. She had not forgotten Harold Fenwick. She had not spent time on him. She was too busy, and time spent on bitterness is time not spent on building, and she had enough building to do. But she had not forgotten him either, and Redstone Crossing was small enough that his name came up occasionally in the ordinary course of things, always attached to a transaction, always attached to money. What she learned in July from Ruth was that Fenwick had done to the widow on the South Road exactly what Ruth had referenced the night Clara first arrived, and had now done it to a third family. A farming family named Prescott, who had borrowed from Fenwick 2 years ago against their next season's crop, and who had had a bad season, and who were now being told that the debt plus interest plus fees came to a number that would require surrendering the property to settle. Clara heard this from Ruth on a Thursday morning and went very still inside, the way she did when something engaged the practical part of her mind that had no patience for obstacles. The Prescotts, she said. Do they have the original agreement? The written terms? I don't know, Ruth said. Find out. Ruth looked at her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Fenwick does this because people don't know what their agreements actually say, Clara said. They sign something in a difficult moment and they don't read it carefully, and then when he comes to collect, they take his word for what they owe because they can't find the original or they can't read the numbers well enough to argue. She was quiet for a moment. If the Prescotts have their agreement and the numbers don't add up to what he's claiming, that's not a debt. That's fraud. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. You'd have to be able to prove the numbers don't match. I can do that, Clara said. I do accounts. She went to the Prescotts that Saturday with Silas because she had told him about it, and he had said without hesitation, I'm coming. She had not argued with this. There were times when the presence of a man who was known and respected in a community was a tool, the same way any other tool was a tool, and she was not above using the tools available. The Prescotts were a family of 4, a husband and wife in their 40s, and 2 teenage sons who both had the look of people who had been worried for a long time and had stopped showing it in order to function. They sat in their kitchen and looked at Clara and Silas with the particular exhausted wariness of people who have been told so many times that their situation is complicated that they have stopped expecting any of those complications to resolve in their favor. Clara asked to see the original agreement. The husband, whose name was Leonard, went and found it in a tin box under a loose board in the bedroom. He had kept it, which was the thing she had hoped for, and brought it out and smoothed it on the table with the hands of a man who had been afraid of a piece of paper for 2 years. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she sat with it for a moment. "What does it say?" Leonard asked. "It says," Clara said carefully, "that the repayment due is the principal amount plus interest at a specified rate over a specified term. It does not mention fees." She looked up. "What fees is he claiming?" "He calls them administrative fees," Leonard's wife, June, said. "Processing fees, handling charges. They're not in this agreement." Clara turned the paper toward Leonard. "Here. This is the total repayment formula. There's no provision for additional fees." She put her finger on the relevant line. "If you pay him what the agreement says you owe, the principal plus the rate in this document, calculated over the term, you do not owe him the rest." Leonard stared at the document. "He said—" "I know what he said." Clara kept her voice level. "He said it without showing you the math because he assumed you'd take his word. Many people do." There was silence in the Prescott kitchen. One of the teenage sons had come in from outside and was standing in the doorway listening. "What do we do?" June asked. "You calculate the actual amount owed. I'll do that with you right now. And you bring him exactly that amount and nothing else. In writing, with a letter that references the specific terms of this agreement and states that this payment constitutes full settlement." Clara looked at them both. "If he argues, you ask him to show you where in the agreement the additional fees are authorized. He cannot, because they're not there." "He'll be angry," Leonard said. "Yes," Clara said, "he will be. He has friends in this town." "So do you," Silas said, from the corner where he'd been quiet until now. His voice was even. "More than you know." Leonard looked at him. Something in his posture shifted. Not dramatic, just the slight change of a man who has been told he is not as alone as he thought. They worked the numbers at the Prescott kitchen table for an hour. Clara walked Leonard and June through the calculation step by step, not doing it for them, but teaching it so they could verify it themselves, so they could stand in front of Fenwick with the number and know it the way you know something when you've worked it out with your own hands rather than being handed it. The actual amount owed was $63 less than Fenwick had told them. June Prescott looked at that difference for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara. "You knew it would be wrong," she said. "I thought it would be," Clara said. "He's done this before. Not exactly this, different details, same shape." "To you?" "To me, he just closed the door," Clara said. "He ran out of room to add fees when there was nothing to start with." She folded the agreement and slid it back to Leonard. "Keep that somewhere you can find it. You're going to need it in front of you when you see him." Fenwick did not go quietly. That was not his nature. He contested the Prescott payment, told Leonard that he was in breach, and that Clara Granger had given him illegal counsel, that she was not a lawyer and had no authority, all of which was technically true and entirely irrelevant to the question of what the agreement said. Leonard, who had gone to the meeting alone at his own insistence because he wanted to handle this himself, had brought the agreement and the calculation and read from both of them with the flat, careful voice of a man who has practiced something until he's sure of it. Fenwick eventually took the money. Not gracefully, but he took it. The story moved through Redstone. Crossing the Way stories moved through Redstone Crossing, and by the end of August, people were telling it in slightly different versions and with different levels of drama, but the core of it remained. Clara Granger had read a contract and found the fraud in it, and shown a family how to stand up under the weight of someone else's dishonesty. Ruth told her about it, the version she was hearing. "They're making you into something larger than you are," Ruth said. Not unkindly. "I know," Clara said. "I just read an agreement. You did more than that." "I did what anyone with accounts training and some time could have done." She looked at Ruth. "That's the frustrating part. It shouldn't have taken me. People should know their own agreements well enough to catch this themselves." "They don't," Ruth said. "Most people are afraid of the numbers." "Then they should learn not to be." She thought about Mara, Tuesday afternoons, the account book between them. "It's not mysterious. It's just practice." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "You know they're also saying it's because of Fenwick, that you had a reason to go after him personally." "They're not wrong," Clara said. "I did have a reason. That doesn't make the numbers wrong." "No," Ruth said, "it doesn't." What Clara did not say and what she turned over privately in the weeks that followed, was that going after Fenwick had not given her the satisfaction she might have expected. She had expected something, some release of the things she'd carried since the day she walked out of his clean office with her letter and her $3.40 and her dead uncle's unredeemed promises. She had thought that watching the mechanism of his advantage-taking get disrupted would feel like something closing. It didn't, quite. What it felt like was more sideways than that. Less like a door closing and more like setting something down she'd been carrying without realizing she was still carrying it. The anger at Fenwick, she had kept it very low and controlled, never theatrical, but it had been there, turned out to have been heavier than she knew. When she set it down, she noticed the difference in her own body. She was very slightly lighter. Silas noticed. He didn't say he noticed, but she saw it in the way he looked at her the week after the Prescott thing resolved. A specific look, the one she'd started calling, privately, his all right then look. The look he got when something he'd been quietly watching had come out the way he hoped. "You're different this week," he said one evening. "Different how?" "Less like you're keeping score." She thought about this. "I wasn't keeping score." "You were keeping something." She was quiet. "I suppose I was making sure I hadn't been stupid," she said finally, "coming here, choosing this. I needed to know that the person who took advantage of me when I had nothing wasn't. I needed to know I wasn't still at his mercy in some way, in my own mind." "Are you?" "No," she said, and meant it completely, which was the difference. He reached across the kitchen table and put his hand over hers. He did not do this often. He was not a demonstrative man, never had been, and she had stopped expecting demonstrations because she had learned to read the smaller, quieter things he did. But occasionally, on no particular schedule, he made a gesture that was simply that, a gesture. His hand over hers on the table, present, decided. "Good," he said. She turned her hand and held his. Outside, the summer evening was doing what Wyoming summer evenings did in the valley, going on longer than seemed possible, the light staying past 8 with a stubbornness that felt like generosity. The garden would need harvesting in the morning. The account book was on the table for the Tuesday lesson Mara had asked to move to Monday this week, because she had a particular question about the fall projection that apparently couldn't wait. This was her life. Not the life she'd been promised and lost. Not the life she'd survived through. Not any life she had specifically planned. This one. The one she'd built from a bowl of stew in a paid hotel room, and 2 nights given as a loan in a decision she had made in a barn while a cow ate contentedly and snow started, and a man said, "I'm asking for you," like it was a simple thing, which it was and wasn't. The first frost came early that year, the second week of September, which caught the valley slightly off guard. Clara was up before dawn. The morning the frost threatened because she'd read the sky the night before and didn't trust it, and she went to the garden in the dark with a lantern and covered what needed covering. The remaining beans, the late squash, the things that had a week of growth left in them if she could keep the cold off one more night. She was on her knees in the garden in the pre-dawn dark when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting Silas. It was Mara, in her coat over her nightgown, hair loose, carrying the other lantern. "I thought you might need help," Mara said. Clara looked at her. This girl, in her coat and her nightgown at 5 in the morning, who had come of her own decision in the frost-edged dark to help cover a garden. "How did you know I was out here?" "I heard you go," Mara said. "I looked out the window and saw the lantern." "You didn't have to come." "I know." Mara moved to the row of beans and started covering them with the sacking the way Clara had shown her. Her hands were steady and efficient. "It's my garden too," she said simply, like it was a thing that had always been true. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she went back to the squash. They worked together in the cold dark for the better part of an hour. Not talking much, just the occasional practical exchange about which plants were most at risk and where the extra sacking was. And by the time the sky started going pale in the east, the garden was covered, and they were both cold and Mara's nose was red, and she was not going to mention any of this because she was Mara. They went inside. Clara made coffee. She made Mara a cup too, weak and with a lot of milk, which Mara accepted without argument, which was itself a thing that would not have happened 6 months ago. They sat at the kitchen table in the early morning while the frost settled outside and the covered garden held. "Clara," Mara said. Hmm? I've been thinking about something. Tell me. Mara looked at her cup. I said I wasn't going to call you mother. I meant it when I said it. I know you did. I still mean it, Mara said. I just... She stopped. Started again. I think there should be a word for what you are. That isn't a replacement word. A real word. For what this actually is. Clara looked at this girl across the kitchen table. The lantern was still on between them because the morning wasn't quite light enough to do without it. And in the lantern light, Mara looked young and old in the same way she always did, the combination that had been catching Clara off guard since the beginning. I think so too, Clara said. I haven't found the right word yet. Neither have I, Clara said. Maybe we make one. Mara looked up. You can't just make a word. People have been making words for as long as they've needed them, Clara said. That's where words come from. Someone needed one and didn't have it. Mara considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that interested her. I'll think about it, she said. So will I, Clara said. They sat with the lantern between them and the frost outside and the covered garden and the sleeping house. And Mara drank her weak coffee and Clara drank hers too strong, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And it was the most comfortable silence Clara had sat in since she could remember. They never did land on one word. What they landed on, over the months that followed, was something more like a set of practices. The Tuesday lessons, the garden, the early morning decisions, the account book slid to the center of the table, the way Mara now came to Clara first with observations she was working through, the way Clara made space for Mara's grief on the days it surfaced, which it did, unpredictably, the way grief does. She did not try to absorb the grief or resolve it. She just stayed in the room with it, which turned out to be enough. More than enough. Eli, as the fall progressed, was a different kind of steady. He had been her ally first, the small, serious boy who had stopped in front of a woman on hotel steps and said the truest thing, and he remained her ally now in the particular way of children who recognize something good and decide to protect it without announcing they're doing so. He kept his observations coming, each one useful, each one delivered in that finished, considered way. The fence line in the upper north field needed attention before the hard freeze. The gray cow was not eating well again, same side as last time, which suggested something habitual. Pete the ranch hand had been cutting corners on the morning rounds, which Eli had been noting for 3 weeks and had now decided to mention because it had happened enough to be a pattern. She acted on all of these. When she told Silas about Pete, Silas looked at her for a moment and said, How long has Eli known? 3 weeks. And he told you. He brought it to me when he had enough information to be sure, she said. He didn't want to say something that turned out to be wrong. Silas was quiet for a moment. He used to bring things like that to his mother, he said. Clara looked at him. I wasn't sad, exactly. Not the heavy kind of sad. More like someone noting something that matters. She had good instincts? Clara asked. She trusted his, he said. She always said he was the most honest observer she'd ever known, including all the adults. He paused. She was right. She was, Clara said. They talked about Margaret sometimes, in that way. Not constantly, not with ceremony, but naturally, when the connection arose. She had stopped being afraid of those conversations sometime around summer. She had realized that the space Margaret occupied in this family was not a space Clara needed to fill or compete with or replace. It was its own space, with its own walls, and Clara had her own. Both could exist. There was room. She had told Mara there was room, and she had found, in the telling, that she believed it. The fall brought the satisfaction of numbers that worked out. The South Pasture extension had done what she projected it would do. The additional cattle were producing. The garden surplus had become a small but genuine income stream, enough to cover the last of the harness debt with $20 to spare, which she recorded in the account book in the column marked Forward Reserve, and which Mara watched her write with an expression of muted triumph. We should expand the East Bed again next season, Mara said. I've been thinking that, Clara said. The Haverfields aren't the only ones who'd buy from us locally if we grew what they need. Mara had the catalog open again, a new one. This season's, with corners folded down at pages she'd been reviewing. There are 3 things here that nobody in the valley grows locally and everybody orders. Show me, Clara said. Mara showed her. They spent an hour with the catalog and the account book and the seed list, building a projection for the following spring that was, Clara thought, both realistic and ambitious. The right combination. Optimistic enough to be worth doing, grounded enough to actually work. This, she thought, watching Mara's finger move down a column of figures. This was the thing Fenwick hadn't accounted for. He had seen a woman with a satchel and $3.40 and nowhere to go, and he had calculated the sum of her and found it small. He had not calculated for what happened when someone like her had time and soil and 2 children who brought observations around corners and a man who stopped on hotel steps because he had promised himself he would not walk past again. He had not calculated for what a person becomes when they stop surviving and start building. The last week of October, a letter came. It was addressed to Clara Granger. She was still briefly startled by her own name some mornings, which she considered a reasonable response to having changed your life entirely in under a year. And it was from the county land office. It was not about the boundary dispute, which had been resolved in the spring with Thomas Marsh's grudging fence relocation. It was about a parcel of land adjacent to the north boundary, a small parcel that had gone unclaimed in a settlement from an estate, and that was available for homestead claim by adjacent property owners. She read it twice. Then she went outside to find Silas, who was doing something to the wagon axle with the focused concentration of a man who has identified a problem and intends to solve it correctly the first time. "There's a letter," she said. He looked up. She handed it to him. He read it, slowly, once, and then looked at the north field. "That's 12 acres, he said, approximately. "And it's good land, so I've walked that side of the fence. The soil's similar to the east bed, deep, good drainage." He looked at the letter again. "The filing fee's not small." "I know, we have the forward reserve. If we use the reserve for the filing fee, we rebuild the reserve with the spring production," she said, "which we've already projected." She held his gaze. "Silas, 12 acres. Adjacent to what we already have. This is the kind of thing you don't let sit." He looked at the land. His land, that he'd been working alone for 5 years, that had almost worn him down to something less than what he was, before she came and put her hand on the other side of the weight. The land that had a garden now, and a south pasture extension, and a repaired gate, and a porch step the right width, and a kitchen where a girl learned accounts on Tuesday afternoons. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She filed the claim the following Tuesday, because she was in town anyway for the market, and because some things you do without waiting. By the time the first real snow of the season came down over the valley, the full, committed snow that meant winter was done being polite about arriving, the Granger Ranch had added 12 acres to its north boundary, had closed out its old debt, had 3 rows of winter vegetables under sacking in the garden, and had a forward reserve that was not large but was real and growing. Clara stood on the porch the evening the snow started and watched it come. The mountains disappeared first, then the far tree line. Then the distance shortened to just the yard, the garden, the barn, the fence line. Everything white and quiet and close. Silas came out and stood beside her. Eli came and stood on her other side, having materialized from somewhere the way he always did, quietly, and at the moment you needed him. Mara came last, pulled her coat closed, looked at the snow for a moment and said, "The sacking on the beans is going to hold." "I checked it this morning," Clara said. "So did I," Mara said. "After you." Clara looked at her. Mara was looking at the snow, her chin up, the serious face she always wore, and there was something in it that was different now from the first time Clara had seen it on the hotel steps, when Eli had said, "Why does she look so alone?" and Silas had looked at her and recognized something. The serious face was still there. Mara would always have that face. It was hers, and it was good. But the thing underneath it had changed. The held-tight thing, the thing that had been keeping itself careful and defended and braced. It was still there in the way old habits leave their mark, but the grip was different, looser, not gone, just no longer needed in the same way. The 4 of them stood on the porch while the snow came down and the ranch disappeared into white, and the barn light made a warm square in the dark. Clara thought about hotel steps in November. She thought about a bowl of stew and the particular shame of being seen clearly when you'd told yourself you were invisible, and how it had turned out not to be shame at all, but something else entirely. She thought about Ruth saying real things are usually complicated, and about Mara saying it's my garden too in the frost-edged dark, And about Silas saying, "I'm asking for you," in a way that meant exactly what it said, nothing more and nothing underneath it, just the plain fact of a choice. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known on those steps. That surviving and living are not the same thing, and it matters which one you're doing. That belonging somewhere is not a thing that happens to you. It is a thing you build, badly at first and better over time, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided the building is worth the cost. That children who have lost something are not broken, they are careful, and careful things need time, not fixing. That a good man's silences can be learned the same way you learn a landscape, slowly, with your eyes open, noticing what changes with the light. That $3.40 is enough to start with, if you're paying attention. Mara shifted slightly on the porch, moved a half step closer to Clara without making anything of it, the way she did things she didn't want to announce. Clara felt it and did nothing, which was the right response, which she knew because she had been learning Mara for months, and that was what she had learned. Some things you receive quietly or you lose them. The snow kept coming. "It's going to be a deep one," Eli said, with the authority of someone who had been observing Wyoming winters for 8 years and considered himself qualified to assess them. "Probably," Silas said. "The cattle will need extra feed tomorrow." "I know. And the north fence post on the east side is still a little loose. I've been meaning to—" "Eli," Clara said. He looked at her. "Tomorrow," she said. He considered this, accepted it. "Tomorrow," he agreed. The snow came down over the Granger Ranch, over the 12 new acres to the north, over the garden with its sacking and its winter vegetables holding underneath, over the barn with its reorganized feed bins and its recovering cows, over the account book on the kitchen table with its columns that balanced and its forward reserve that was growing. It came down over all of it, the way Wyoming snow comes down, without apology, without asking what you want, simply arriving and covering everything equally, the things that were struggling and the things that were strong. In the morning, it would all need digging out. The path to the barn, the garden perimeter, the steps, all of it requiring hands and time and the willingness to start at one end and work toward the other without knowing exactly how long it would take. Clara had been doing that since November. She was not afraid of it. She looked out at the white and felt the porch under her feet, the step the right width, the boards that held, and felt the 4 of them standing in a line in the cold, and felt the warmth of the house at her back that she had put her hands to making warm, and she thought, this is what was possible. Not perfect, never perfect. There would be hard seasons and disagreements and money tight enough to make everything feel precarious and moments of doubt that arrived without warning at 3 in the morning. There would be days when Mara's grief surfaced and there was nothing to do but stay in the room with it. There would be the ongoing project of learning each other, which does not end, which is in fact the thing itself. Not a stage you pass through on the way to certainty, but the permanent condition of choosing someone and being chosen back. All of that was coming. Some of it was already here. She had chosen it with her eyes open. That was the difference. Not rescued into it, not desperate into it, not settled, not trapped, not managed there by circumstance and told to call it fate. Chosen. On her own 2 feet, with her own examined reasons, on a cold morning in a barn when she had tested the question one more time, and the answer had come back the same way it kept coming back. She looked at the snow. Behind her, through the kitchen window, the lantern was on. Someone would need to make coffee in the morning. Too strong, still too strong. They had not resolved this and possibly never would. And the beans in the garden would be checked and the cattle fed and the loose fence post attended to and the accounts updated and the catalog consulted for next season's expansion. All of it waiting, all of it hers.